Good morning, everybody, and welcome to our POPI training today. We are talking about the new rights that have been created in terms of POPI, and I'm going to get right to it. If any of you have any questions that you would like to ask me, please feel free to use the chat function. We will be getting to your questions towards the end of the session. So just use the chat function and feel free to post your questions there, and we will get those answered for you. Right, so what are we talking about today? I first want to take a little bit of a step back. So as many of you probably know, this is the third talk in a series of talks about the Protection of Personal Information Act. And so I just want to make sure that we all have some of the background that we already discussed in the previous two sessions, just to make sure that everybody can follow along with us. So for those of you for which this is old news, I do apologize, but the stuff that I'm about to say is also very important, so perhaps it bears repeating. Right, so what is the Protection of Personal Information Act about? The name gives us some hints, right? So it's about personal information. And just to remind you, personal information is any information that you can relate back to an identifiable individual or an organization. And personal information includes things like your name, your contact details, any identifying numbers like your employee number or your ID number or your passport number, when you were born, what race you are, where you live, information about how you perform at your job, or if you are a student, your academic performance, information about your behavior, health information, and the list goes on and on and on. In databases of big companies that track sort of people's personal information, you will often find as many as 5,000 entries. That's not a number that I made up, and I'm going to circle back to that number towards the end of the session, right? So there is a lot of information out there that can be related back to an individual and organization. Sometimes they will be identified, other times they will just be identifiable. What I mean by that is sometimes we wouldn't necessarily know a person's name, but if we linked information with other information in the public domain, we might be able to figure it out. And that also counts as personal information, right? So what is POPI about? It's about protecting personal information. So when we talk about protection, there are a number of ways, and this is kind of a summary slide for all things POPI. There are a number of ways in which we protect information. So there are three things that we have to keep in mind. First off, when we protect information, that is about information security. So on the outside there you see confidentiality, integrity, and availability. Those are the three facets of information security, and that is going to be something that we talk about later in the series quite a lot. So we have to keep the information safe, not just from malicious people like hackers, but also from accidental disclosure or losing information. So information becoming lost to us, accidentally deleting things that we don't have backups about. All of that is about securing information. Then we have things that are about privacy. And so privacy is about what information an organization is allowed to have and what they are allowed to do with it, right? So this is about the acceptable use of information. So there are a couple of principles that are relevant when we talk about privacy. The first sort of rule of thumb is less is more. So we're not allowed to use personal information more than we need to, right? So that's why we say less is more. What is the least amount of information that we can process the least number of times in order to achieve whatever purpose it is that we're trying to achieve? There are also principles like transparency. So we also say that employees, students, vendors, whatever person or organization we're talking about, they have the right not to be surprised. They need to know or be made aware of what personal information we have about them and what we do with that information. And that is why the university has published several privacy notices. That the aim of those notices are to inform people about what we do with their information. Then we need to be very, very careful when we share information. That is usually when people feel that their privacy is being harmed, is when the university or another organization starts sharing information with other organizations. Often it is necessary to share information, but there is an evaluation that needs to be done in order to ensure that that sort of intrusion in the person's privacy is warranted. And we're going to talk a little bit more about that sort of assessment or evaluation in a moment. Then we need also people to think about what they are using information for. So to check if this is something unusual, to check in with the POPI team in order to make sure that we have the right justifications for processing personal information. And the more sensitive the information is, the more important it becomes that we kind of check ourselves before we get into trouble. So it's incredibly important that we think about POPI even before we start doing things with personal information. Then we get to kind of the third grouping, or the third group of obligations that the university has, and then we're at the end of our little POPI speed date, and that is records management. So once we've gotten through everything that helps us keep information secure, and we've thought about whether we're harming a person's privacy, whether we're justified in doing it, then we get to the third area, and that is records management. So let's say we're talking about students. Students start their relationship with us as applicants, right? So they're applying to the university. And then when they get admission and they get registered, there is a status change that happens. They become students. Some applicants never become students, right? So we are not going to process their personal information beyond that point, but we need to keep a record of who applied to the university, whether we admitted them or not, and if we didn't, why, right? So we need to think, what is the information that we need to retain? Similarly, when students graduate, they become alumni. That's a bit of a status change. That doesn't mean that we can just delete everything that went before. There are extensive records that the university needs to retain to document a student's life at the university. And so we need to think, what do we need to keep and what can we get rid of? So the principle here is use it or lose it. We need to have reasons for everything that we retain. And if we decide to get rid of information, let's say it's a copy of information that we already have elsewhere and it's backed up, we need to think about how do we destroy information. And that circles back a little bit to security, right? So if I'm going to delete information, how do I do that in a secure way? And we will talk about that in future sessions as well. So that gives you the backdrop of today's discussion. And that is our little summary of POPI and everything that it involves. So information security, privacy, and then records management. But today's topic is data subject rights. So there are a couple of rights that data subjects, and data subjects is just the way in which the legislation refers to individuals or organization whose personal information it is. So in a university context, that could be a student, it could be an employee, it could be a research participant, it could be even a service provider or other organizations that we work with. What are their rights? What are the things that they can do in order to protect themselves? Or what are the ways in which we can ensure that organizations comply with POPI, and that is what we're going to be talking about today. So the first thing that is really important to understand, and we've seen this in questions that we've gotten from you in the past, is the right to privacy. In other words, the right to mind your own business is not absolute. It is a constitutional right. In other words, it's in the Bill of Rights. So it is very important, and it's foundational to who we are as humans. And we have that right, but just like any other right in the Bill of Rights, it is always qualified, right? So POPI itself explains it in the following way. So on the one hand, we have this right to privacy, and on the other hand, we have organizations, and they could be public organizations or private ones, so companies or even government or a public university like UCT have the right to go about their business, right? So public universities, for instance, are pivotal to helping people exercise another right, which is the right to education. So we constantly have to balance the right to privacy with all of these other rights and the right of the university to go about its business. And the Information Regulator, which is the body that is tasked with overseeing POPI compliance, must, in terms of the legislation, also take into account the rights of organizations to operate in an efficient way. So you're constantly making doing this exercise of weighing up, is this infringement of a person's privacy justifiable when it's measured against the university's function as a university? So constantly we are going to be doing this assessment. It's also why there are no black and white rules in terms of POPI. It's all very principle based, which can be frustrating at first. Right, so I'm going to teach you some sort of techniques in order to do this balancing exercise. So one of the things that we have to discuss first, and as we walk on this tightrope, is that over the last year or so, POPI has now been enforced for a while. There have been some myths that have been created, and we see this in our popi@uct.ac.za inbox every now and again. The most harmful myth when we are talking about data subject rights is that people seem to think that in order to do stuff with your personal information, I need your consent. Most of the time, and I am now in this story, the university, most of the time the university does not need your consent to process your personal information. This is incredibly important. This doesn't mean that it can just do what it wants. It has everything but carte blanche to do what it wants, but it does not need your or the student's consent to process personal information in all but a handful of instances, right? So this is why this bears repeating. We're going to bust this myth today. So when can an organization such as UCT process the personal information of its clients, so students, or of its staff, or of research participants, or of other organizations that it has a relationship with? First and foremost, we have to do everything that we need to with your personal information in order to comply with our contract with you. Right? So that sounds a bit strange at first, but if you think about it, when we think about our relationship with our students, there is a contract with the student. At its very most base form, that contract says, we are going to provide you with an education and you are going to pay us for that, right? Similarly, with staff, there is a contract. The contract says, you are going to do work for us and we are going to pay you your salary. And when we talk about organizations who are also protected by POPIA, let's talk about service providers like my organization, for instance. I have a contract, a service level agreement with the university. It says I am going to do some things, this training, for instance, for the university, and in exchange, they are going to pay me. Right. So what are all of the things that we need to do in order to honor that contract? And you will find that that is quite a lot. So everything that we tend to do with staff information, with student information, 9 times out of 10 is so that we can comply with our contract with you, so we can pay you, so we can manage your performance, so we can provide students with an education. And in those instances, we do not need the consent of the data subject. That doesn't mean that they don't have other kinds of rights. It just means that I don't need consent. The second reason why we process a lot of information is because there are other pieces of legislation that tells us to. In the context of students, the piece of legislation that we are mostly trying to comply with is the Higher Education Act. An example would be that every year the government requires us to share information about our students with government. For many reasons, but one of them is so that the government may calculate the subsidy that it needs to pay the university. Right? So every year we share a massive amount of information about our students with government. We don't need their permission to do that because we have to do it. There is a piece of legislation that was signed by the president and is the law, and we need to comply with it. In the case of staff members, there are pieces of legislation that govern that relationship. So the Labour Relations Act, the Basic Conditions of Employment Act, the Employment Equity Act, all of those pieces of legislation tells us that as an employer, we need to gather and store and use certain pieces of personal information. Let's talk about a really contentious one. The university constantly is asking its staff members information about their race. This often makes people uncomfortable, and I think we all understand why that is the case. It is a topic that makes people uncomfortable, and we can empathize with that. But fortunately or unfortunately, depending on your political leaning, that is the law of the land. There is something called the Employment Equity Act that requires us to report to the Department of Labour, for instance, on the racial composition of our workforce. Right. So that we don't need employees' consent to do that because we are forced to do it ourselves. There is a piece of legislation that was approved by Parliament that dictates that. And so there are literally hundreds of pieces of legislation that forces organizations such as the university to process personal information. And under those circumstances, we don't need a person's permission. Then third, there are things that have to do with staff members and students and even the public's health and safety. And all of us are familiar with this because we've just come out of 2 years of all kinds of rules and monitoring being done in the name of health and safety. There again, consent isn't required. In fact, it would be harmful to require consent because then we wouldn't be in a position where we could discharge our responsibility to keep our students and staff safe. So again, you've got other rights, but you don't have the right to be asked before we do things that relates to the health and safety of data subjects. And then lastly, there is also something that is called the legitimate interest of the university. So that's where we're back to our slide on the balance, right? So sometimes there are things that we have to do, not required by contract, not required by legislation, not required by health and safety, where we have to process personal information. It often has to do with ensuring that the university functions as efficiently as possible. It sometimes has to do with how we monitor our staff and students. And in those cases, again, the university does not necessarily need your permission. But as you will see in a moment, you do have the right to object to how your information is being processed. So this consent thing, my message to you today is forget about saying things like, you didn't have my permission to process my personal information, because 99% of the time, we don't need consent. There are some exceptions. So for instance, when we send newsletters to our alumni database, then we might might have needed consent, or if we market the university to other people, or in some instances where we want to do research using our very sensitive information. Those are some of the examples that we see sometimes where consent is required, but in most cases, consent isn't required at all, or you will have a right to object. In other words, we can process your information unless you tell us that there is some persuasive reason relating to you on a personal level that makes that processing unfair, right? So that is not to say that you don't have other rights, and that is what I want to spend the rest of our time together today talking about. What are those rights? And then we're going to talk about how the university must handle handle it when data subjects exercise their rights. So today you're here with two hats on before I carry on. You yourselves have rights because you are data subjects. We're all data subjects of a number of organizations, but you also work for the university. And so sometimes you might receive emails from students or other staff members, depending on your role, where they are exercising their rights. And we need to be sure that the university handles those requests with a lot of respect, but also that we handle them expediently and efficiently. Right. So what are these rights that I keep harping on about? Here they are. So first off, very importantly, in order for POPI to work, we all have the right to access to information. And there's actually another piece of legislation that has been around for longer than POPI that also regulates this. It's called the Promotion of Access to Information Act. Without having information about how your information is being processed, you can't exercise any of your other rights. So this is kind of like the foundational right. So how this presents itself in practice is you have the right to ask the university what personal information of yours the university has and what it uses it for. Right? So earlier I referred to privacy notices. We've published a number of privacy notices that answer the question, what information does the university have and what do we use it for? Right? So you have a right to that information, which is why we publish it preemptively. Obviously, those documents are very broad, and you might want more specific information about what information the university has about you. And that is why you also have the right to request a record of the specific information that the university has about you. So this is what we call an enabling right. Once people have access to their information, they normally want to use that access to exercise another right. And that is where the rest of these rights come in. So now once you know the university has got this information about you and the university has told you this is what we use it for, people have, and this is a very hypothetical right, if the university has got information about you, but they don't use it for any purpose, you have the right to tell them to destroy that information or to restrict that information if it's only being kept for purposes of proof. Right? Probably, again, 99% of the time, the response to a request for deletion is, unfortunately, we can't delete your information because we need to retain it for the following reasons. And normally that has to do with records keeping. But you have the right to ask us, and we have the responsibility to tell you why we have to retain what we retain, and we have to restrict that information if it is not in use in other areas of the university, for instance. Another thing that could happen is you could ask us to correct your information. So here I want to tell you a story, and this is a real story. about myself, and I'm going to give away some personal information, but I'm doing that voluntarily now. So a couple of months ago, I kept receiving phone calls from a certain laboratory saying that I owe them money for a blood test that was done. Now, I didn't recall having my blood taken, and I'm very scared of needles, so I would recall that, right? So I asked them, please, can you send me more information because I don't recall having my blood tested for anything. They then sent me a result on which I could see there's my name and my address and even my contact details, but this ID number is wrong. How I knew it was wrong, I know my ID number, obviously, but what gave it away is this person was born in 1957. Now, I'm old, but I'm not that old. I could also glean from the information, because I have just enough medical knowledge to be very dangerous, that this person clearly had some kind of cardiac event because they were testing enzymes that normally get tested to see if a person has had a heart attack in the Goodwood in one city. Can't remember what kind of hospital this is. I think it's a Netcare. Right. So I politely wrote back to them and said, this is not my test. There is an information quality issue here. And they said they'll fix it. Yet the next week I get another letter of demand for this unpaid bill. So now I'm starting to get irritated. Luckily, I know a bit about POPI. So I write a letter to the information officer of this laboratory to say, I demand in terms of POPI that you correct my information. This is not my ID number. I never had a test like this. Do it now. And voila, problem solved, right? So once people have access to their information, they have the right to insist that you correct that information. And this is incredibly important because very often where there are quality issues, there are also potential data breaches. Remember, because they had my information wrong, they sent me health information about someone else. I could easily have found out what that person's name was. I had their full ID number. And so information quality issues are incredibly important, and data subjects have the right to insist that the university correct the information. Sometimes there'll be a dispute between the university and the data subject about the correctness of the information. So let's think for a moment of a student, right? So students get marks for various things. Let's say a specific student, Elizabeth, fails her privacy law exam. She gets 48%. Now I request to see my script and I see actually I got 51%. Now someone captured my mark incorrectly. I can insist on the correction of that mark. But let's say the paper shows that I did get 49%. I can't now insist that you change it to 51% because you can prove that I did actually fail the test. Right? So sometimes people will ask for correction of details where there is a dispute between the university and the student. And so the university obviously can then show proof that that information is correct. Then very often, so often in fact that you can almost interpret it as always, a data subject has got the right to say, I object to this processing of my personal information. The university must then say to them why that processing is necessary. So we have the right to an explanation for why my personal information is being processed in this way. And that is a very important right. Again, the university must then come up with a reason. More often than not, the university will be able to come up with a reason, but you have a right to that explanation. To understand why it is that information is being processed in this way. Then there's a fairly rare right that you have, and it's rare in the context of the university. In other contexts, this happens quite often. Sometimes organizations use algorithms to make decisions about us. All of us have experienced this. It's rife in the financial services sector. When you apply for insurance, when you apply for loans, there is an algorithm that passes your personal information and makes a decision about whether to give you this loan or not and what kind of interest rate to offer you, or whether to give you insurance or not and what kind of premium to give you. You have a right to understand how those decisions are made and to make representations, because sometimes these algorithms are being fed information that is incorrect or misleading, or sometimes the algorithm itself can be biased, and so people have a right to understand how the algorithm works at a fairly high level, and then to make representations about why the decision made by the algorithm was incorrect. Ordinarily, where we see that is where we ask people, for instance, for credit reports and stuff like that. It comes from credit bureaus. We might also see it in determining who needs to get access to certain types of healthcare. But we don't see a hell of a lot of automated decision making in the higher education context yet. There are all kinds of nifty new pieces of technology that we might put in use in future, where, for instance, we can start predicting how students might do in exams based on historical data of other students that are like this student. So I almost think about this as a, the kind of algorithm that Netflix uses to determine what movies or shows you might like. And so usually where we see new technology, we might see algorithmic decision making. That is a very high risk activity. The university has to be very careful in how it evaluates that technology and determining whether it's fair, and know that data subjects have the right to understand how that technology works and to make representations where they feel that decisions made by the robot, that's why that says bad robot, is biased or unfair in the specific circumstances. And then lastly, if there is some kind of processing that's happening based on consent, you have the right to withdraw that consent at any time. But as I said, there are very, very few instances where consent is required. Sometimes, or more often than not, in the higher education sector, we see that play itself out when we talk about research. It's not always required, but sometimes it is. And that consent needs to be voluntary. In other words, the research participant, if they were asked for consent, they need to be able to withdraw that consent at any point, and the processing must stop. But again, just a reminder, 99% of the times consent is not required, so that right then becomes irrelevant. If a data subject feels like we haven't listened to them properly, or we haven't respected their rights, or they're not satisfied with the university's response, they have the right to complain to the Information Regulator. The Information Regulator is a statutory body that is created under the auspices of the Department of Justice back in the day. They've been around since about 2016. There is a complaints page where you can go to fill in a form, and what will happen then is the Information Regulator sends the university a pre-investigation notice. And for those of you who are wondering, is this regulator active? Yes, they are. We are seeing organizations getting these pre-investigation notices, and then the regulator will investigate whether the university responded appropriately in that specific case. Right. So those are all of your rights. You have these rights because you are a data subject of the university. Some of you are students of the university. I am a vendor of the university. Right. So we all have these rights, but by virtue of the role that we play at the university, we're also staff members, and so we also have to prepare for the fact that sometimes we might be the recipients or on the receiving end of another data subject, usually students or other staff members who are trying to exercise their rights. And what do we do when someone demands that we delete their information, or demands that we correct their information, or wants to object? And the answer to that is fairly simple. The response to these things can often be fairly technical, and it is very important that they are handled correctly and well. And so this is the email address that you use when you're unsure how to respond and you want to get some advice on what is the appropriate response to a data subject request. You are more than welcome to ask us for advice. But you might be thinking, why is this important at all? Like, why must I worry about these data subject requests? Well, first off, it's because it's the right thing to do. We have an ethical obligation to process people's personal information with respect, and that has at its heart a very healthy respect for people's rights. This is a human right after all, and so we want to make sure that the university responds well and consistently and in accordance with the various ethical and legal rules that apply to responses to data subject requests. And we laughingly or mocking often say that it can be incredibly difficult to respond to these data subject requests. If you think about it just for a second, imagine a staff member asks today of the university, what personal information do you have about me? Full well knowing the very broad range of things that it is considered personal information, or about a student. how easy do you think it will be for the university to formulate an answer? The answer is not easy at all, because this information is in various systems spread across all of the different parts of the university. It's not just in if it's a student in a faculty, it's also in the various sort of support services in environments in the university. So it's spread very far and wide, and so we need coordinated responses. The reason why this is important is normally, if you think about the psychology of a person trying to exercise their rights, and think now of my very practical and personal example. When I received that second letter of demand for an account that isn't mine, what do you imagine my mindset was? At that point, I was already pretty angry. And I was also quite flustered. It's anxiety provoking getting letters of demand with red, bold letters on them. So my mindset was already one of unhappiness. So what is going to happen if my request subsequently to the information officer was ignored? Luckily, in this specific case, it wasn't. Well, I'm going to complain. And obviously, as staff members of the university, we would like to prevent the university from getting into trouble. And that's why a coordinated response to these types of requests is important. If we look for a moment, and I realize, that it talks about regulatory compliance can be dull as ditch water. But if you want to enrich your sort of understanding of privacy rights and how it operates in society, you can go and watch a movie. It was called The Great Hack. And it was made about the scandal a number of years ago now of Facebook and Cambridge Analytica. You'll remember what was happening was that a company called Cambridge Analytica was assisting the Donald Trump campaign to target the American electorate through Facebook, through social media. And they were getting incredibly large amounts of information about all registered voters. This is where we come back to the 5,000 bits of information. They had 5,000 bits of information about every voter in America, and they could hyper-target them with specific content that they knew would change their minds to vote for Donald Trump. Now, before we get too judgmental about this, Cambridge Analytica also did work on the Obama campaign, and even in the early 90s did some work for the ANC in South Africa. Now, Cambridge Analytica no longer exists. The reason for that is when it started becoming known out there as a result of an investigative journalist called Karen Cadwallader. She works, I can't remember which newspaper now, but she did an expose of the type of work that Cambridge Analytica was doing using Facebook information. That was the result of a whistleblower. And what happened after that is Cambridge Analytica got hit by hundreds of what we call data subject requests. So hundreds, if not thousands actually, of people were sending them requests for information. They wanted to know, what is the 5,000 things that you know about us, Cambridge Analytica? And rather than answer those, because they knew how exposing that would be, Cambridge Analytica closed their doors. Right, so this is how important data subject rights are. They have the power to close down organizations. Now, I'm not suggesting for a moment that the university is doing anything approaching that kind of processing that is harmful for society. In fact, quite the opposite. When universities think about how they process personal information, they do it with their ethics hats on, and because we are in the business of doing research, those are considerations that we are used to taking into account. But that is how important it is that the university takes it seriously when people try and exercise their rights. The other reason is at a much more fundamental or crude level that they lead to complaints, and we'd rather not have to deal with the Information Regulator. Now, this is an article of a couple of weeks ago. This is now closer to home because I realize the Great Hack is perhaps a little bit far from home in the UK and the US. Here is an article from just the 6th of June. Here's a paragraph from that article, and if you look there where you see that arrow, it was about a data subject request to a public university in South Africa this year. Right. So what I'm saying is not abstract, it's not hypothetical. People are trying to exercise their rights, and if the university or the Information Regulator itself, in this case, it was the IR itself, is too slow, they go to newspapers. So obviously, again, the stakes are high. It's about the reputation of the university. So when we receive these data subject requests, what are the things that we need to keep in mind, except for the fact that at all times know that you can ask for advice at popia@uct.ac.za. Right, things you need to think about. When you think about how you are going to deal with personal information in your day-to-day job, always imagine, what if what I'm doing right now becomes public knowledge? Because at any point it could. People have the right to know how their personal information is being handled. So if you are leaving a file full of sensitive information in your car, or if you are leaving files lying around, or if you are emailing sensitive information to someone else, think, what if the people whose personal information I am handling knew, or what if the public knew what I am doing with this information? Am I being careful? Am I keeping it secure? Am I balancing the right to privacy with the necessity, for instance, to share information? Do I have the right to do what I'm doing? You need to constantly be thinking that, because information is handled on a day-to-day basis. Normally, there are hundreds of decisions, tiny decisions that you make over the course of your employment at the university about how you are going to handle personal information. Right, so always, and I find it helpful to think, A, would I mind if people knew, if it was in a newspaper article, of what I just did? Or do I think people would be surprised about what I'm doing or how I'm doing it? In that case, normally check yourself. So send an email to the POPI hotline and we will gladly give you advice on how to do it. And that way you can go about your business with peace of mind. When you are processing information, also always keep in the back of your mind that at any point a request could come through to say, I want to know what personal information you have about me and how you use it. That request might come from the registrar's office because they received a POPIA request, a request for access to information or a record of information. It might come from the POPI hotline. It might come from another employee, but you need to think to yourself, how will I remember, or how do I keep a record of what I do with personal information and who I might have shared it with, etc. And then lastly, keep the information up to date. If someone asks you to update personal information, let's say correct an incorrect email address or correct an incorrect ID number, how do you make sure that everybody else who uses that information at the university also updates their version? So if someone asks you to correct information in your files, think about, how do you ensure that that information is corrected across the board at the university? What was happening in my example with the laboratory was the people who were doing the debt collection were probably updating the details that I was giving them over the phone on their files, but they forgot to update somewhere else in the lab, maybe accounts receivable or wherever. And so they got asked again to collect the debt. And obviously somewhere there, the information was not filtering all the way through to my record. So do think about when people ask you to correct information, how do we make sure that we don't make the same mistake twice? Because that is very, very difficult to justify. And also, not only that, it often leads to data breaches. As a result, I know I haven't gone through the trouble of trying to find out who she is, but there is a 67-year-old lady in Goodwood who probably had a heart attack and went to N1 City. Right, so that is, if I were a malicious person, I would not need much more information in order to assume her identity and commit fraud. So that should give you pause. It is incredibly important that we keep the information that we use up to date everywhere where it is held at the university. And then lastly, we need to move fast. So that newspaper article that I just showed you about the South African university, I'm not sure exactly what happened, but I can read between the lines that the people are upset because they didn't get an answer quick enough. So if someone tries to exercise any of their rights, they might do it to you because you might be the person that they're dealing with. Refer it immediately. Don't sit on these requests. Don't send them from pillar to post. Refer it immediately. You can use the hotline or you could email the registrar as the Deputy Information Officer of the university, and let's sort it out as quickly as we can and keep the university out of the newspapers. I'm sure that we can all agree that that is a good thing. Right, so here's that email address again. I'm going to stop sharing my slides now because I want to check whether you have any questions for me. So if you have questions or observations that you would like me to address, please do. Other than that, and before I get to the questions, also keep an eye out for future sessions. We are still going to have another couple of sessions, some of them on information security, for instance, which is another large and very important topic for discussion. Right, let's see what questions you have for me. I'm hoping there are questions. Otherwise, we'll give you the gift of time. It is loading. Right, so I'm going to take it from the top. What about all of the random text messages that come from people who have not been given my number by me? Okay, so spam. That's a fantastic question, and I'm sure we're all interested in it. I also get still a lot of spam and a lot of SMS or telemarketers phoning me. And I always go, who are you? Because I don't recall dealing with you before, so you have no reason to have my number. So now what you can do is you can use your right to access to information to ask them, where did you get my number? Now, companies are allowed to get your number from other places. They may have a legitimate reason why they did so. Very often spammers do not. So the next step, once they say, well, we bought your information from so-and-so, is then to lay a complaint with the information regulator, because at some point when information is being bought and sold, someone probably needed your permission. That is one of those rare instances where consent probably is required, is when someone wants to make money off your information. So that's the first thing that you can do. The second thing is they're not allowed to send you an SMS without your consent. So you can go and lay a complaint against them for doing direct marketing without permission, because that is another one of the 1% of times that you must be asked for your permission, is if someone wants to send you electronic direct marketing. So that's SMS or email. Telemarketing, slightly different. They are allowed to still telemarket to you unless you have told them to stop. So if someone is phoning you and you don't want them to phone you again, say, I unsubscribe from your telemarketing, don't ever phone me again. And they must say, sure, we won't. And if they do phone you again, you can lay a complaint with the information regulator. If you can't tell who sent you the SMS, that in and of itself is a breach of POPI. So you can take a screenshot of that SMS and you can lay a complaint with the information regulator, who will then investigate who the number belongs to. Right. Very helpfully, Ronica, who is our project manager for POPI, has put a link to the UCT privacy notices in the chat as well. For those of you who are interested in reading them, you will find it there. There is also a link to the complaints page for the information regulator. So another question, how does POPI relate to telemarketers? We have not opted in or given consent to be contacted. So the telemarketers have two problems. The first one is, how did they get your information? So again, this is more or less the same question as the one that I fielded before. They don't have to ask you for your consent to phone you, but you have the right to unsubscribe. So just make sure that you do that. Right. In our building at Health Sciences, they put up notices on the doors with staff members' personal cell phone numbers in case of emergency without our permission. Please discuss the balancing of right in that case. To clarify, I'm not a health and safety rep. So this is a good example. So obviously there are health and safety reps. We are required to put up certain notices in terms of the Occupational Health and Safety Act. So that we can keep people safe. If you are not a health and safety rep, I would say that you are within your rights to ask why it is that your personal cell phone number needs to be displayed. So unless there is a regulatory reason why it needs to be your number, that is a legitimate question. So the balancing there happens in asking the department why it is that your number needs to be up. If the answer is you're the official health and safety rep, that is the end of the story. If the answer is not that does not necessarily mean that your name must come down, but the department needs to have a justification for why it needs to be your number. And if there is a less intrusive way to achieve that purpose, then they must take that less intrusive way. So I would certainly ask them what their reasons are. I can't, unfortunately, speak for them. So I am interested in what POPIA says about metadata. So metadata is an interesting topic. So metadata, as the name suggests, is information about information. Typically, for POPIA purposes, the type of information that we need to have at our fingertips is: where did we get this piece of personal information? When did we get it? An audit log of when it was changed or updated. So that is an example of metadata. It's basically just a record of how that information was processed. Another bit of metadata might be who this information has been shared with in the past. Now, what I'm talking about now is incredibly difficult to achieve. Even the world's most mature organizations from a data governance, information governance point of view do not necessarily have metadata that is that comprehensive, but it is something that we should work towards. So if you think about data subject rights, you need to think about what is the information that I need to store about the information so that I could answer the question, where did I get this information? Often with a bit of sleuthing, we'll be able to piece it together, but the easier we can make it for ourselves to keep a record of how information comes into the university and what it's used for and who accesses it through access logs, etc. It is important, and it is something that we should be looking at the very least in our main information systems. Right, we have provided the link to the Information Regulator's website there for those of you who are looking for it. Question, what about all of the filing cabinets we have in various offices across the university with student files that contains personal information? What about areas that do not have lockable areas for filing? Okay, so POPIA is all about reasonableness. So obviously it is not possible to keep personal information on under lock and key at all times. So the trick is to think about what personal information is this? In other words, how sensitive is it? The more sensitive stuff, so employee files, for instance, do need to be kept under lock and key as much as possible. When you think about filing cabinets, though, I also want you to think about efficiency. Real estate, so office buildings are expensive. So is it necessary for you at all to keep these files in a hard copy format? Very often we are keeping duplicate filing systems. In other words, these files are also available online or are kept in multiple locations. And so we should be undertaking exercises where we think, do I need this filing cabinet full of files? So if someone walks into your building one day and they walk out of your building with a bunch of files under their arms, and make no mistake, people, there are people doing this. I know, because often I pose as one. I try and walk in and see what I can walk out with, which will then enable me to do identity theft. The question that the regulator will ask, if it emerges ever that this case of identity theft was the result of theft of physical information from the university, is why did you have that sensitive information in hard copy form? If you do not have an answer to that, we are going to be in trouble. If you do have an answer and it's reasonable, we'll be fine. But you do need an answer for it. So you need to think critically about where paper is stored and why. If it is just a copy of a copy of a copy, it's going to be very hard to justify. Right. Estate agents said they got my details from the deeds office. Okay. So companies are allowed to get information from public records. A public record is a record that is maintained by a public body. So the deeds office is a public body, right? They need to be able to show that they got all of the information, even your cell phone number, from the deeds office. That is hardly ever the case. Normally, what they have done is they've gotten some information from the deeds office, which they then matched with credit bureau records of you. Now, that becomes a little bit problematic. How I know is it's also a little bit creepy. Right? So what should have happened is at some point, someone in that chain ought to have notified you that your information is being gathered in this way. At the very least, you would have had the right to object. So I would definitely object to that. When people give me that answer, I also often ask for proof. But just know that to a degree, companies can harvest information out of the deeds office, but then after that, they need to be very transparent about what they're going to use that information for, and also don't just take their answer at face value. Often there has been linking with other information that is not held in a public a public record. And the internet is not a public record. It's not administrated by a government authority. And so you are only entitled to harvest things like cell phone numbers off the internet if you can show that that person put their cell phone number there deliberately. So if you disclose personal information about yourself deliberately to the world on the internet, then they do have the right to collect that information. And so that is why it's so very important that we think about what personal information we let out there. Okay. After the TransUnion breach, I even get WhatsApps now. That one, yes. I must say, South Africa has had rather large data breaches, which means that we do always have to be on high alert for scams. Luckily, on WhatsApp, you can pretty immediately block the number, which is very useful. What is the position on emailing a group of people where there are personal email addresses? I often get emails, work and personal, where everyone's listed in the to field. This gives access to people's email addresses. That newspaper article that I showed you, that is a breach that happened in this way. That's what she's describing, a group email to 1,000 people where their email address is visible in the to field is a data breach. We have to notify the information regulator that it happened. You have to learn to use the BCC function. In other words, if you are sending a group email to a large number of people, blind copy them. Otherwise, you are disclosing personal information to unauthorized people, and that is something that we have to, the university would have to tell the information regulator about, and that is uncomfortable for obvious reasons. So thank you for that question. That is a fantastic question. Does the POPIA Act allow for information that you gather on another person without their knowledge for the purpose of whistleblowing to prove bullying, verbal and emotional abuse? Okay. Yes and no. It depends on who the you is in that statement. So obviously, if someone is bullying you and you are keeping information about them to substantiate a claim that you are going to make, that is okay. It's when people start collecting information behind each other's back and there isn't an allegation already of bullying or something like that is against policy or against the law even. So for instance, harassment is against the law. And so obviously when you investigate people for potential criminal misconduct, that is okay. For purposes of proving it, for instance, for purposes of submitting that information to SAPS or to at the whistleblowing hotline of the university. You have to be incredibly careful, though, about sharing that information, because at that point it is still just an allegation and you do not have authority to prove and make decisions about a person's guilt or innocence, right? You're not a court of law. There was a newspaper article, and this is going to sound somewhat like I'm like a hyperbole, but there was an example of someone who got arrested in the UK for stealing, of all things, sausage rolls, and the police mislabeled and published allegations that this person is a pedophile and they committed suicide. That, in addition to just being reprehensible, is also a breach of the POPI equivalent legislation in the European Union and in the UK, right? Because we have to be so careful when we cast aspersions against other people. So I say what I've just said about the gathering of this kind of information under extreme caution. And it's always better to rather make the report and let the official channels investigate the complaint rather than doing some snooping on your own, because the chances that you accidentally disclose something that might not be true exposes you to enormous amounts of risk, not just in terms of POPI, but also in terms of defamation and other forms of injurious behavior. Okay, we have funding applications, which means it includes ID info of students and parents and salary information, and we don't have a lockable area. Okay, so it sounds to me like you are talking about physical information. So the question that immediately pops into my head is, why is this being done in a manual way with paper applications? I assume that there is a justifiable reason for that. So then my next question is there a way for you to put a lock on the area or to use a designated office as your filing room? So you see the process that I'm going through. At every point, I need to justify it. So you need to show that there was no other way in which you could do this. So in the first place, did you have to do it in paper form? Is that information not also digitized? Did you have to If you had to do it in paper form, why? Did you explore all other alternatives? And then if you do have to do it in paper form, have you explored all options to lock it? You even have to be able to show the regulator, we investigated using this room, it would have cost too much, or whatever the reason is why you didn't do it. So you need to be able to show that you considered these security issues, and if it is justifiable, then you'll be fine. But you have to show that you thought about it. I don't like the university having my personal cell number. I don't have another landline. So how do I get around not having this used for work purposes such as IT authentication, etc. that requires it? If I received a cell phone allowance, I'd get another phone to have 2 numbers. Andre, I'm not sure whether you want to come in here. I'm not sure if the university has got an official electronic communications policy on the use of personal cell phone numbers and when it can and can't be used for 2FA. I will have a look at that for you, so I can't answer that question off the cuff. So many employers, for various reasons, do use personal cell phone numbers. It is then about setting boundaries for it. It is often, this I can say, considered in this day and age fairly normal to have a cell phone number that does the service of both work and personal use. The only thing, there's no obligation on the university to pay for a second cell phone number. So if you are uncomfortable, unfortunately, that is probably what you are going to do. As I said, I'm not aware what the university's official policy is. I will look into it for you, but just know 90% of the time that is just if you are uncomfortable, unfortunately, the employee's prerogative to provide the university with an alternative means of contacting you outside of a landline number. There's no obligation on the university to do it in another way, but some employers do that for various reasons. Is it okay to SMS students to advertise workshops or courses? Do they have to go through an opt-in process? I'm assuming this is advertising courses to them for which they have not enrolled, so additional workshops or courses, and the short answer to that is yes. We do need to ask them whether they want to receive marketing about courses that are unrelated to the degree that they have enrolled in. And just like that, miraculously, I think I've gotten through all of the questions. I'm just quickly checking that I haven't missed anything. Thank you for these questions. They are very good questions. We also have a team site dedicated to our POPI work where there are various frequently asked questions. These questions that you have asked now will also be posted there. Ronica, I don't know if you just want to post the link to that website so that people can go and see whether if they have any other questions, whether those aren't already answered. Other than that, I cordially invite you to attend the other staff information sessions that are coming up. And we will be talking about many of these issues that you raised today, and I want to thank you for your active participation.